that's how they launched the lifeboat nowadays. That boat is the Henry Blogg. It's obviously named after Cromer's most famous character. But for generations, the lifeboatmen, who are all fishermen, have lived in this quarter of Cromer. They all lived very close together. The reason for this was so that they were within hailing distance of each other. Henry Blogg himself was born in this area. In point of fact, he was born in a house which stood on the spot where the Wellington Hotel now stands.
The sea was in Henry's blood from the day he was born in 1876. Even as a child, there was nothing he wanted more than to become a fisherman like his father, John James Davis. Life was hard for young Henry and his brothers, for they were out in all seasons after crab, mackerel, herring and cod. When they had a moment to spare, they would watch the topsail schooners beaching with coal from the north. Sometimes, when their father was not about, might follow the progress of unloading. But when the wind veered to the northeast, the temper of the sea changed, and vessels were in grave danger of being driven on shore. Many were the tales that Henry had heard of wrecked schooners and hobblers held fast by the treacherous Haysborough sands some 13 miles out, or even further away on Hammond Knoll, held fast till their backs were broken by the conflicting currents. He had read how the townspeople, distressed by the continual loss of life along their coast, had subscribed in 1804 for their first lifeboat. Henry was determined to join the lifeboat crew as soon as he could wield an oar full strength. And this he found he could do after 6 years at sea when he was 18. The Louisa Hartwell first put to sea under Henry in 1909. She was a far cry from Cromer's first primitive lifeboat, followed in 1845 by a more serviceable rowing boat fitted with buoyancy tanks. The first row and sail lifeboat was a self-righting roly-poly copped by Henry's grandfather. He lived to see the roly-poly replaced, at the crew's request, by the Benjamin Bond Cabell No. 2, a good broad boat with a curved keel, clinker-built at Yarmouth to a design similar to that of Cromer's second boat, which allowed the crew to get right up into the bows and the stern. This was the boat in which Henry first saw service, under his stepfather, John James Davis. In a manner similar to this, the Louisa Hartwell was launched one day in 1917 to go to the aid of a small Greek steamer that had begun to drift during the night. It was slow work pulling the boat over the sand and down to the water's edge, and even harder to get her away in the tremendous sea. Soldiers stationed in the town plunged waist deep into the water to hold the boat on an even keel, for she was threatening to capsize in the surf. Eventually, the crew, pressed by a grim Henry, pulled her away, but so strong was the tide that she drifted a full mile westward, narrowly missing the pier before she could make sufficient offing to set sail. The steamer was not more than 2 miles away, but it took the lifeboat 4 hours hard sailing to reach her and take off her exhausted crew of 16, and yet longer before the boat safely beached again. The drifting steamer was thrown ashore under the very eyes of those soldiers who, earlier that day, had helped to launch the boat to her crew's rescue. Meanwhile, another urgent call found Henry and his weary men launching again. An explosion had ripped the Swedish ship Furnibo in two. Twice the lifeboat was launched, only to be driven back with many oars smashed. But Henry would not admit defeat and launched a third time, to the amazement of the crowds on shore who watched, taut with fear, as the lifeboat fought her way from the surf towards the two halves of the Furnibo. Laden with wood, they were drifting landwards. 8 hours after the explosion, 11 terrified men were still clinging to the stern half of the Furnibo. Henry knew he had to win this time and urged his tired crew forward. They would succeed, and they did, bringing the 11 men ashore after 2 grueling hours. It had been a tough day. As the survivors made their slow way to the nearest inn, they looked back to see the two halves of their ship approaching shore. The breakers had begun their evil work, scouring the cargo of wood from the holds and scattering it along the beach. Relieved of their buoyant load, the hulks settled more firmly into the sand, stark evidence of the sea's ill-spent fury. The crew had carried out a magnificent rescue under Henry's inspired leadership. They were the first lifeboatmen to be awarded the bronze medal, while their cocks received the gold medal, the Lifeboatmen's V.C. Henry was intensely proud of her husband, who was so devoted to his lifeboat that he rarely left Cromer. Her one regret was that he told her so little about it, or about the times when he went to London to receive his medals. Though Henry was very reserved about the things that touched him deeply, he always enjoyed talking casually with summer visitors. So Annie had to rest content with their praise of him, knowing from his crew's accounts that it was richly deserved. Henry spent all his leisure time looking after his deck chairs and beach huts. Yet, at the back of his mind, he was always alert for any mishap or sudden change in the weather.